Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course. This is Critical Reasoning, Philosophy 105, I believe. My name is Dan Tui. I'll be your teacher for this course. This is a course overview video, which I'll try to explain why I'm teaching the course the way I am, why I've chosen the kind of materials I have, just generally speaking, explaining my approach and giving you a sense of what we'll actually be reading and doing. There is another video which you'll find in the introductory section of the Blackboard site, which is a practical course tour, which I think I've already sent out as an announcement. But take a look at that for the nuts and bolts in terms of what you need actually to do in this course, what the requirements are, things like that. Well, I've taught Philosophy 105, Critical Reasoning, many times, and I've taught similar critical thinking courses for different schools. I'm an adjunct here at Drexel. I've been teaching at Drexel almost 25 years off and on as an adjunct in philosophy. And I've taught this course many times. And I got to say that it's a tough course, critical thinking courses, critical reasoning courses. There's a long history, we don't need to go into it, of why these sort of courses emerged and what they were meant to do. And that has changed quite a bit over the decades that critical thinking or critical reasoning courses have been taught in American colleges. I have found it, as I said, particularly problematic because it's not really clear what it's supposed to do and what students are supposed to get out of it. If we look at the second of the two definitions I have here, reasoning, that is pretty standard. What is reasoning? It's the drawing of inferences or conclusions from known or assumed facts. Got that from my dictionary. Perfectly good definition of reasoning. And usually critical thinking courses, we call it critical reasoning here at Drexel, but in the wider world, it's usually called critical thinking, so I may occasionally call it that. That critical thinking courses are really about the reasoning process, very close attention to the formal aspects of making inferences. An inference is a conclusion that we draw based upon something else that we think we know, as the definition says. The making of inferences, because B, then C, is basically an inference. Because I know that B is true, I also know that C is true, is a classical inference. It's this reasoning from what we know to something else. And that is basically logic, implication and reasoning. And logic is a whole field unto itself, formal logic. And some critical thinking courses get into formal logic to some degree, and I have done it in the past. But usually it's done in a formal way. What I mean is that the kind of arguments that we look at in critical thinking courses are really just there for the sake of analysis. Their content is usually not very important or interesting, and it's a purely formal exercise in developing our skills in identifying arguments, that is, identifying the inferences that are actually made and whether they're sound arguments and things like that. And that's a whole way of approaching it, and I've certainly taught it that way in many ways in the past. I have not ever really been satisfied with that way of teaching it, and I've gone in a different direction in the way that I put together this particular course for us. And I would say that the main difference in the way I'm approaching it is that I care very much about the content, not just the form. The arguments that you will be presented with in this course all come directly from the history of Western philosophy, from Plato, from Bertrand Russell, from Descartes, Machiavelli, Wittgenstein. They're all classic texts, mostly excerpts, short excerpts from classic texts in the history of Western philosophy. And so to a certain extent, this class can double as an introduction to Western philosophy. I don't have anything from Eastern sources or from non-Western sources. That's just because of my training and background and knowledge. Um, so one of the big differences I would say in our approach is that content does matter. And that is part of my belief that you cannot separate the formal from the material. That is, that in looking at reasoning and looking at good reasoning and learning how to evaluate reasoning, you really can't separate the formal aspect of reasoning, the logic, from what actually is being talked about. And that is a wrong way to go about it, I believe. And so if we take a look at the materials that I've gathered for this course, starting with Russell's Appearance and Reality, the first chapter of his The Problems of Philosophy, what you'll see is that I've chosen really what I consider to be really what are favorites of mine, what I consider to be classic examples of philosophical reasoning. I mean, almost all philosophy is reasoning. So, when you're doing philosophy, you're thinking and you're reasoning. So, I mean, each one of these, I would say, really wonderful texts is an example of a philosopher doing what philosophers do. And what philosophers do is, that's not always clear, but what they're doing is looking for truth. And what they're doing is looking to uncover some aspect of reality and some aspect of our own relation to the real, the knowing subject, the human subject's relationship to reality. And I think that, as you'll see, I mean, there's really no separating the content from the form here. You'll see that each one of these here, let's just dip into Epicurus's letter to Menoicus. Just this little excerpt, wonderful little excerpt, where Epicurus is talking about death, the nature of death, and how we should approach it. It's a wonderful little exposition, it's a wonderful little argument about what death is and how death should be considered by the human being. Something very famous too, this little argument by St. Anselm, the medieval philosopher, theologian, his proof for the existence of God, which of course is reasoning about. But each one of these authors is concentrating very hard. They're not saying, oh, I want to do some reasoning. What they're saying is, I want to find the truth about a certain matter, and I want to establish that my conclusion about it is true. So they're engaging in reasoning, argumentation, leading up to a claim, and trying to justify that claim through forming arguments, through reasoning, through inference and implication. So what you'll see is each week something really great, I think. And each week we have an example, sometimes more complicated and far-ranging, sometimes more narrow, of reasoning by philosophers. So it's philosophical reasoning. This is the famous Wittgenstein lecture on ethics from the 1920s, in which he lays out certain theses about the nature of morality or ethics, which is really quite wonderful, and it's really important text. So you'll see we range from Plato to medieval philosophers to early modern philosophers like Machiavelli and Descartes, John Locke. Really just wonderful things. And all things that I'm familiar with through my own education that have made impacts on me, and that I think I've chosen each one of them because I think they're particularly good, fairly compact examples of the kind of reasoning that philosophers do. So one of the things that you're meant to get out of this course is just a familiarity with philosophy. Philosophy is critical reasoning. There's just no question about it. So spending time with these texts is spending time trying to comprehend the arguments of these texts. So your appreciation of a certain type of critical reasoning, a certain style, the kind of style that philosophers typically engage in. There's one non-philosopher here, although I would certainly call him a philosopher, or obviously a scientist whose work had huge philosophical implications, was Darwin. This excerpt from The Descent of Man, where he's trying to understand human intelligence and moral capabilities in an evolutionary framework. Really standout, landmark passage from Darwin in terms of human self-understanding. Really couldn't be more important. So that's what we have here, is we have texts from the history of philosophy, all of which are texts that are argumentative, that have reasoning in them. The text that really inspired me to do the course this way was the opening of our first reading, Russell's Appearance and Reality, because it seemed to me to really show in a particularly nice way how philosophy is critical reasoning. Maybe philosophy is paradigmatic, because after all, what does critical mean? I've just drawn, as you know, from looking at reasoning, I've drawn definitions from my dictionary just to get started here. Critical means characterized by careful analysis, and it almost is an echo of what Russell says here about philosophy, where he says philosophy is merely the attempt to answer such ultimate questions, not carelessly and dogmatically as we do in ordinary life and even in the sciences, but critically, after exploring all that makes such questions puzzling, and after realizing all the vagueness and confusion that underlie our ordinary ideas. To be critical is to be self-reflective. To be critical is to be, to be aware of what the foundations for one's beliefs actually are, or to be aware of what the supposed foundations of any claim really are, and to actually look into them and to carefully evaluate whether those claims or beliefs actually have a rational foundation, that is, whether they're actually true. I think that that's what philosophy does, and that's what Russell is saying it does, is that when he talks about ultimate questions, he's talking about metaphysical questions, basic questions like what is real, and basic questions like, given that there's something real, how can I know it? Ultimate questions like, how ought I to live? All the questions of philosophy are ordinary questions that we deal with just because we're human beings, but most of the time we just avoid looking into them for one reason or another, because we just don't do it. But the questions are all there, like deciding, for instance, whether God exists. I mean, that is a metaphysical question. How would one actually prove that God does or doesn't exist? But it's kind of a thing I think most people take some kind of position on. Either God does exist, there is no God, or maybe there is and maybe there isn't, which is another position, right? All of which are the result, hopefully, of a reasoning process in which you've actually thought the thing through and come to the most likely conclusion that you can find. It's what philosophers do. So, again, if we look at the actual content of the course, if you look in the main menu, this is hitting on many of the great, not only great philosophers in the Western tradition, but the great subjects, the distinction between appearance and reality. Very similar, well, not similar in every way, but a similar undertaking by Descartes in his Meditations, asking, what can I actually know with certainty? The ontological argument, which is St. Anselm's argument for the existence of God. Does God exist? What is the nature of death? From Epicurus. What is morality, and can we actually make moral statements? From Wittgenstein. The excerpt from Locke's Second Treatise of Government. What is the purpose of government, and is it legitimate to under what conditions is it legitimate to overthrow a government? From Political Philosophy. These are all just really, just really great interesting, important, relevant subjects. And again, could serve, with some, the readings would be longer if it were a straight up introduction to philosophy. But they tend to be shorter because that's not what we're doing. It's not an introduction to philosophy so much as an introduction to philosophical reasoning, which is done differently by different thinkers. But the main difference, aside from the length of the readings, our readings tend to be shorter, is what you are doing with them. And that leads us to the weekly assignment, which is the heart of this course, is this weekly assignment, which I've done a video on. I've touched upon in the practical course tour. But if you look at the weekly assignment, what you need to do every week is to focus on the arguments that are actually presented in the text, show that you grasp them, and you have an idea of what the arguments are, and engage in critical reasoning of your own, in which you actually evaluate the argument. You'll see that the prompt for every week's assignment is the same, but it basically has two parts. One is you have to give an account of the argument that's in the text, both the support and the conclusion. And two, you have to move on and do an evaluation of that argument. Is the argument a good one? Why or why not? That is, you must engage every week in critical thinking, critical reasoning of your own. That's a holistic process in terms of reading and writing. You need to be a critical reader. That is, you need to read carefully, and you need to ask yourself, what point is being made? How is it being made? And is it being made in a convincing way? That is the argument a sound one? Is it a good one? Whatever it is that the philosopher is trying to get across, do they actually do a good job of supporting it? A very famous section here from Machiavelli's The Prince in week 7, which is a very compact, very easy to handle argument, in which he makes a specific claim that it's better to be feared than to be loved if you're a political leader, at least a prince of his time, where he makes a certain argument. He asks that question, and he answers it, and he gives an argument in support of it. That's a fairly easy, compact, again, easy to handle sort of argument. Some will be not so easy, but every week you're doing the same thing. You're looking at a piece of philosophical writing, which is about some subject. You're trying to understand it as a whole, and then you're saying, well, okay, what is the big point here? What is the overall point that the author is trying to establish, the main conclusion, and how are they getting there? That is, how are they trying to establish it? And then, say, what is the critical reasoning here? And then engaging in your own criticism of it. Is it a good argument? Does the argument persuade us to a sufficient extent? And to what extent is really up to you to decide the truth of it. So, I think that it should be, no matter what it is, it should be an interesting course, because we're reading interesting stuff. And you will profit by a close reading of these texts. And I think that your critical reasoning skills are bound to be helped by this. You will be engaging in careful analysis. You will be engaging in careful analysis of someone else's careful analysis to get kind of, what we'll actually be doing. You will be looking at the drawing of inferences or conclusions from known or assumed facts. You'll be doing it yourself. It's just that we'll be concentrating on philosophers doing it about philosophical topics. And part of that is, I hope I've explained why I'm teaching the course the way I am. But part of it is, this is my background as a philosophy teacher. These are the books that I know the best. And rather than sort of looking for just specimen arguments from the media or just made up arguments, I thought I'd give you the best. And although this may be tougher reading, and it may sometimes be tougher to characterize just what the argument is, because the subjects that they're looking into are so difficult, I think this is much more interesting for one thing, and hopefully in the long run, more meaningful in terms of having experience with reasoning, having material upon which to exercise your own critical reasoning in that weekly assignment, and hopefully coming out of it, yeah, with a kind of a, if you don't have any background in the history of Western philosophy, you will after this course, but hopefully you'll have more than that. You'll also have the experience of trying to critically evaluate these arguments. So I hope this gave you some sense of what the course is about, why it's a critical reasoning course, what my specific approach is, and what sort of things you'll be doing when you look at these texts. As always, I am your online teacher, so this class will not meet in any kind of live session. So you should feel comfortable emailing me or calling me on the cell phone number that I provide in the introductory section to talk obviously about any practical difficulties you're having with the course. If something isn't working out, I'll be giving you feedback on your weekly assignment, and you should feel comfortable just talking to me if you're having trouble with the reading, or if you're having a problem in devising, in getting your weekly assignment together, or when it comes to the final exam for the course, which I explained in the practical course tour. Any questions at all, please feel free to contact me.